Don, I'm so glad you're here.
Hey, Katrina.
Thank you for joining us. You are, as I was saying, John is the resident expert in what can actually be done with your property. In fact, John, you teach classes, you teach brokers, you teach people how to actually interpret, right, the laws, the state laws, and then understand what that actually means for them in each of the different jurisdictions because it's very different. Can you introduce yourself? Tell a little bit
Yeah,
about
you
it.
bet. So I was in construction for 5 years before coming to real estate about 30 years ago. And since then, I've worked with some builders and built some homes and condos and townhomes and things like that a little bit, in addition to being a real estate broker. And so I'm a real estate broker still after all these years and not building for myself, but really wanted to get a handle on these new laws, House Bill 1337 and 1110 that a lot of people have heard about. The middle housing bill is one of them. The ADU bill is another one. And as some people have said, this is kind of a gold mine potentially for homeowners, for investors, and yet there are some pitfalls and it's pretty complicated. Middle housing is different from ADUs, and so there's two different paths that sometimes we can add units to a property or other options like that. And then there are different jurisdictions. So there's county jurisdictions and there's city, and not all the counties in Washington state are on board with all of this right now. Some counties are coming later for the middle housing, but King, Snohomish, Pierce, Thurston, I think those are all right now already as of July 1 last year, 2025. Everything changed. And so for middle housing. And so it depends on whether you're in a large city, medium-sized city, a small city, not within the city limits. Each of those has their own path. And then in each neighborhood, potentially you can run into some pitfalls depending on whether there's CCNRs or other rules that might preclude it. And you still have to, let's say you wanted to put a ADU in the backyard and your neighbor's done it or somebody else, it may or may not work in your case. So we have to look at the setbacks. We have to look at that specific jurisdiction. Even though the state passed laws, different jurisdictions are interpreting it in their own way and they have the freedom to do that. They don't all have to do exactly the same thing, which
And
is
you
good
were
for
you were
flexibility.
you were mentioning to me about really the range of how jurisdictions are adopting it. These changes, like some are actually going above and beyond what the state said they need to do,
Yeah.
and some, that they're really the state's going to have to give them a nudge or a push. Can you talk a little bit about what that range looks like?
Yeah, and a lot of jurisdictions that are the largest cities, what they call tier one cities, Seattle, Bellevue, Everett, Tacoma, and a few others, they allow much higher density on what they still would call a single family lot. We've always called it a single family lot. That hasn't changed, but in some cases you can get 4 to 6 units on those. But I know I talked to a planner in Everett, for example, and she said, hey, we no longer have a unit count maximum for middle housing. So if you have a large enough lot, it's all just governed by setbacks and other density requirements, but not actually unit count. So even though the state law might say 4 units in this case, 6 units in this case in Everett, Everett might interpret it differently. That said, I have some conflicting information from different people. So we really need to always look at it very carefully and talk to the jurisdiction. And then there's other things that are going on in terms of just building requirements and things, which do differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Another example is the city of Lynnwood. They said, hey, we decided, even though we are a smaller city, we are going to operate like a larger city if you have at least a certain number of square feet in your lot. One other exception would be the city of Shoreline. And they said, hey, we are a tier 2 city. We're one of the smaller cities, but our population is getting close to tier 1. So we're just going to adopt more like tier 1 rules in terms of which would allow more units. So it really
Yeah.
is interesting to see how each jurisdiction is interpreting it. And then there's other places where, for example, city of Edmonds, they said, hey, we don't want townhomes. Whereas in Seattle and so many other areas, that's going like crazy. That's a type of structure. They do allow middle housing in Edmonds. They don't want Edmonds to, in their mind, to turn into a townhome place.
So you're a property owner and you have gotten past all of the hurdles, understanding what it is that you can actually do by right on your property from the perspective of the state laws or the local jurisdictional adoption of those. But that's not necessarily everything, right? So you've made it through all of that. And now what can happen?
One of the biggest,
It's still
one,
not a pass or play, right?
yes, yeah. One of the biggest things that is going to hurt some investors who think they know what they're doing, or some homeowners who get ahead of themselves, perhaps. Um, when a plat is recorded, oftentimes the developer, whether it was 2 years ago or, 100 years ago, they may have put restrictions on that plat. So what we do is we look at the face of the plat map and we see if there are restrictions there. And in some cases, it might have language that says something like, all lots in this plat shall only be used for one single family dwelling, blah, 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 and have other restrictions in terms of size or things like that. And some people have looked at their CCNRs that are in their neighborhood and they didn't see something there. And maybe the only reason it's not there is because it was on the face of the plat map and the CCNRs were created later. In other cases, it's the opposite. And we might have a restriction in the CCNRs, but not on the plat map. And so you really have to be thorough in checking those things out. And, there's other potential pitfalls too with critical areas. In other words, things like wetlands or proximity to a stream or a lake or a steep slope, and to give a few examples. And so you really have to be careful to make sure that you are very thorough before you spend money. There's one other thing that happened that was quite a horror story for an investor who bought an existing home that had an ADU added to it legally prior to these law changes that happened that were implemented here in 2025 that made it easier to do ADUs. This person bought an existing home with an ADU, had been permitted, I think it was City of Bellevue, and they decided that they wanted to rent out both the upper floor of the house and the lower floor of the house as it was set up. So to essentially turn it into a duplex. And they found out after a neighbor complained or something like this, the city came and said, hey, when that was built, there was a covenant created at that time, because this was our restriction at that time that it was built, that it had to be owner occupied in one of those units. And so here an investor bought something and turns out was unable to use it the way that it had been, the way it had been presented to him. So it was a real disaster. And so
And
there are
so
so
in
many things.
question for you. So in that case, had the ADU been built now and permitted now and built now with the current laws, they would be able to rent that.
Yeah.
However, because it was built prior to these going into effect, they now can't do that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, that is correct. And it's very, very difficult to undo that restriction, even if everyone kind of agrees, because it involved prior parties who are no longer maybe there. And it was kind of perhaps considered as an implied covenant to the neighbors or something like that at the time. Anyway, the bigger thing is it involved prior parties who are no longer in the ownership position. So it got very complicated. So the great news is there's still huge potential, but the trick is you really have to be thorough and make sure that you're going about it the right way. And then, the other fascinating thing, you can sometimes divide these properties off. You can maybe take an ADU that has been built in that backyard, and either through the condominium process or through a subdivision or something like that, there is a more new legislation on the way that's supposed to allow a single lot to be split off more simply without a lot of excess regulation. Point is, you may be able to create an entire new unit that could be sold off. So it's not always something that you have to just keep as a rental or something like that, although that can be
Well,
great.
and I'm going to insert something there. So, yes, you can build something that could be sold separately. However, the design comes into play here, right? So, if
Massively, yeah.
you're financing a dadu or an ADU that's detached, then financing is easy because FHA traditional financing considers that the same as financing a single family. However, if you take a condominium and they have a shared wall, that's a consideration, and that may not be financeable for the same products.
Right. Yeah, it is tricky because financing does start to enter into these things, especially when you start talking about condominium. There are regulations. and there's a little bit higher interest typically on these condos for the same,
Mhm.
for a loan. There's a variety of considerations, and there's more scrutiny to the HOA or the CCNRs or the entire condo resale package, the whole package of legal documents, and that kind of thing has to be reviewed with
And
more scrutiny.
the thing about it, and to your point of what you were saying earlier, is if you know where to look and what you're looking for, 9% of this, wouldn't you say, is discoverable before you spend a big chunk of money?
Yes, yes, it is. If you're careful, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
We have, we have 3 lots in Shoreline there on the 105th Street light rail station, just not even just half a block away. And so that was upzoned, right? So there's all
Yes,
single family homes there now. And then because we're so close, we can go up 70, we can go up 70 feet. So we have 3 contiguous lots, and that sounds great, right? However, when you get to the face of the plat, it was actually on the face of the plat. And it was actually really cool because this was a plat that was in the early 1900s, and it was a husband and a wife. And the wife
oh wow,
actually signed. I mean, that's unusual, right? The wife
yeah,
actually signed on that, and the husband both on the face of that plat. So I love that. But they covenanted it so that, or they put a restriction on so that only single family homes can be on any of these parcels. Thankfully, because of the location and because of the neighbors who were in there, we were able to have everyone come together and sign an agreement so that that was able to be removed. But that was a very long process, and it
wow,
was a heart-wrenching process as well,
yeah,
right? Because everybody has different reasons for living where they live, and different expectations of how long they want to stay there and how they want it to, the neighborhood to exist. So that one actually ended up working out okay, but
wow.
it was years of that, that conversation before there was any kind of resolution.
Yeah, yeah, that can be very difficult. Fortunately, there's another potential exception, even if there is a restriction on the plat. If someone else has violated that, it may become an unenforceable thing. So again, you need guidance, and the title company can have their input and see if they're going to insure it and so on. But you definitely want to have some experts involved.
And I think the thing that, I heard you say, and that I just feel like can't be stressed enough, is that if you know where to look and you know the right questions to ask, 99% of these problems would surface before you ever ended up with a big investment. I know people personally who it's been the opposite of that. Everything looked great. They had experts who told them that yes, they can go ahead, and they get to the point of applying for building permits, or they get to the point of actually have even already built. In one case, this was in Edmonds, already built. They were in the building process, so it wasn't complete. And the neighbor came over and said, I see you added it looks like you're going up a certain height here and you're adding another story. And he's like, oh, yep, yep. And it turned out that there was something on title, or on the plat agreement when they subdivided it, that he could not do that.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Through permitting, in construction, and this was an extremely expensive home. And I mean, I think hundreds of thousands of dollars in just architecture and designing this beautiful custom home, and it turned out they couldn't build what
Oh
had
my
been
goodness.
designed and
Yeah.
approved.
I had a client that had similar hopes for a property, and we discovered that there was a view easement that would restrict property like that before. And boy, you'd hate to get too far down that road before you figure it out.
So, to the point of, and that all pointing to, just make sure that you have someone who has the experience, who's been through this, that they've been boots on the ground. They know, what it is that you need to look for. They know where to go and find those, little hidden pieces of information that aren't easily discoverable. Otherwise, if you don't already know where to go look.
Absolutely. That's well said.
Let's see what else. There was a project you had told me about that I wanted to ask you. Shoot, and now it's gone just that fast. How about even just the idea of, yeah, like, what's under the ground? So you
Oh
buy
boy.
this.
Yeah.
I know this will be painful, but go ahead and tell.
Well, I have a story for that one. So some of the last townhomes that I built 15 years ago or so in North Seattle, usually what we would do, and like if I'm representing a builder and we buy land, one of the things that I put in there is that the buyer is able to dig test holes and check the soils and so on. So even though I routinely might put that in an offer agreement with a seller, I myself was unable to do that when I bought this property. It was an old duplex, really ugly little building, and the entire lot had been paved with asphalt back when it was built in the 50s or whatever, with the exception of a couple little planting spots that were full of roadies and that kind of thing. So the point is, we could not really dig test holes without digging through the asphalt. I mean, even right down the sides of the building, everything was asphalt. I rarely see anything like that, but didn't think too much of it. Sometimes we have to dig deeper for a foundation, sometimes we don't, but we go down to bearing soil, and that's what we do. So the day that they demolished the duplex and started digging, one side of the hole for the foundation on the south end of the lot was fine. And I don't remember how far down, 6 feet or something, perhaps a little deeper than normal. But as they went to the north side, they started pulling out stumps and tires and all kinds of things. Apparently,
That's really solid soil. That's really solid.
That's just what we want to build on. No, you can't. And yet somebody had, but I mean, we're not going to do that. We can't do that. Somehow, back in the day, I guess somebody got away with it, but we never want to do that now. So we ended up going quite deep, had to truck away all of the debris and bad soil to get down to the bearing soil. So the point was, half of that lot was on like a ravine. And so we had to go really deep on one side and then haul in by truck solid rocks to pack back in there with a big machine.
And what does that mean, really deep?
Man, I can't remember what it was. It was probably, I don't know, 14 feet or something like that. That would make for a very expensive foundation, if you just poured it that
That's a
way or
lot.
something like that. And then you'd have issues with structure. The better thing to do was to bring in structural rock and smash that into place, with a big, huge track hoe machine and all of this, and build it back up. So then you could put in a normal foundation on a very solid base. And that wasn't going to go anywhere. But boy, I was over at that time. It was over budget by like $40,000 for the foundation on day one. So fortunately, that
40?
doesn't happen too often. Yeah, that was a lot.
And that was 20 years ago?
Yeah, that was 15, 20 years ago. This was like 2008. So yeah, that was a lot for foundation cost on day one of the project to just like blow out your budget.
Pulling
But
out old
you know,
tire,
it
things people buried long ago, thought they were forgotten about.
Oh yeah, no, and suddenly that paving made a little bit more sense. That I don't know, maybe they were trying to, because the other half of the ravine or whatever, the property on the deep side of the hole was another duplex. It was absolutely identical. So it was the same party, I think, who built both of those, and I bought one. And I thought, oh, maybe that's why. Maybe they knew what they were doing, what they were building on. But in any case, yeah, there are
That's just
literal.
one story, right? Like, Jon, so as you're telling this, I've got like 5 coming to mind of lessons the hard way that I've learned. It's like, and so maybe we should do a little series of, we'll all be
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I can tell you about my broken foundation story from years prior to that, going back another 15 years prior again.
Yeah. And there was a house on Queen Anne that we didn't discover until after we'd closed. It was Liquefaction. It had a liquefaction. It was on a liquefaction zone. And oh man, that
Wow.
same house, this was when I was really just getting into this in, about the same time frame and maybe a little later. And because I had to learn so many things the hard way, because there wasn't anybody to teach, at that point. And I had one roof I put on 3 different times in the same house because I had shitty contractors. I had people, that. So there's actually, just because somebody's licensed, bonded, and insured does not mean they're going to do it doesn't even mean they know how to do the right thing. So
Yeah, that is
so maybe
true.
more to come on all of that.
Yep, I think so. I'm sure there's some more stories
So
that will come up.
So just long story short, reach out and just give us your address, reach out, get on the phone, get on a video call, and we can walk you through things that we can see just right out of the gate that should be considered before making a big investment in doing some sort of development.
Yeah, it's huge. And I find that a lot of people are surprised at the things that need to be checked and surprised that the information is often readily available if you know where to look. So, yes, absolutely. Reach out.
And John, you actually even train the real estate brokers, right? Because real estate, you go to real estate school, you get your license, you sit for the state boards, you pass the test, but nowhere do you learn about the things you need to know to advise or even understand comp plans, land use, building codes, any of that, right?
Right,
And so you
right.
teach brokers, and you're the one who people go to find, to learn, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. With the construction and development background, it brings another element that a lot of agents don't know, a lot of homeowners don't know. And so I've taught classes in new construction, in development, and zoning and land use, and then now these new laws.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a blast.
All right,
Thank
take
you.
care.